Was Europe truly ready for a winter that devoured half its people? Did the Vikings truly stumble into a nightmare, or were they architects of their own doom? The wind howled a lonely song across the fjords, a sound older than memory, colder than the glacial heart of Scandinavia. It wasn't just the wind, though, it was the silence. A silence that pressed down, heavy and suffocating, where the cries of seabirds used to dance. 50 years of gray, 50 years of a sun that refused to warm. It started subtly, a chill in the autumn air, a shorter summer. Then it escalated. The snow came early, lingered late, and piled high, burying fields and villages under a relentless, frozen blanket. Let's rewind. 13,000 years ago, the ice retreated, a slow, agonizing crawl across the land. Imagine a giant, slumbering beast pulling itself free from a millennia-long sleep. As it moved, it carved out the fjords, colossal, watery scars slicing through the mountains. It sculpted the lakes, filled the valleys, and reshaped the coastline. It left behind a landscape of breathtaking beauty, but also a landscape of profound instability. The land itself was breathing, rising, and falling, a geological teenager still finding its footing. This was the foundation, the bedrock upon which the Viking world would be built, a world teetering on the edge of a precipice. The people of Scandinavia, the Nordmen as the English scribes called them, were a hardy bunch. They were seafarers, warriors, traders, a people intimately connected to the rhythms of the sea and the bounty of the land. They lived in small, scattered communities, each fiercely independent, each reliant on the other for trade and protection. They built their lives around oral traditions, stories passed down through generations, tales of gods and heroes, of battles and voyages. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were their history, their law, their identity. Then came the dust. Not the golden dust of a summer sunset, but a gray, insidious dust that fell like ash from the heavens. It coated everything: the snow, the trees, the boats, the faces of the people. It was volcanic fallout, a consequence of eruptions so colossal they darkened the sky for years. The sun became a distant memory, a pale ghost behind a veil of soot. The crops failed, the animals starved, the rivers froze solid. The kingdoms, the petty polities that dotted the landscape, began to crumble. The social cement that held these communities together, kinship, loyalty, shared hardship, started to dissolve. Imagine a ship without a rudder, tossed about by a storm. That's what Scandinavia became. The warriors, once united in battle, turned on each other, vying for dwindling resources. Families fractured, alliances dissolved. The old ways, the old gods, seemed to offer no solace. There was no single cause, no singular event that triggered this catastrophe. It was a confluence of factors: the volcanic winter, the gradual warming of the climate, the inherent instability of a land still adjusting to a new shape. But the volcanic winter acted as a catalyst, accelerating the decline, amplifying the existing tensions. It was like pouring gasoline on a smoldering fire. Let's talk about Norway specifically. Picture this: colossal glaciers grinding their way down from the mountains, burying the land under a mile of ice. These glaciers didn't vanish overnight. They retreated slowly, relentlessly, over thousands of years, carving out the fjords that define the Norwegian coastline. The land itself was rising, slowly but surely, as the ice melted, creating deeper harbors and wider rivers. But this rise wasn't uniform. Some areas rose faster than others, creating a landscape of dramatic contrasts. Then there was Sweden, a land locked by mountains, a realm of dense coniferous forests. The climate was harsh, unforgiving. The forests, vast and impenetrable, made travel difficult, communication slow. Agriculture was limited to the river valleys, where the soil was fertile and the water flowed freely. It was a land of isolation, of subsistence farming, of a life lived in close connection with the rhythms of nature. And Denmark, a different story entirely. A low-lying plain, crisscrossed by rivers and dotted with lakes. Fertile soil, abundant resources, and a strategic location, Denmark was the breadbasket of Scandinavia, the hub of trade. The Danes, pragmatic and resourceful, built a thriving maritime economy, dominating the Baltic Sea, but even Denmark wasn't untouched. The Fimbulwinter, as the sagas would later call it, brought hardship and devastation. Villages were abandoned, fields lay fallow, and the population dwindled. Yet, even amidst the chaos, opportunities arose. The weakened kingdoms of Norway and Sweden were vulnerable, ripe for conquest. The Danes, with their strong navy and their control of trade, began to exert their influence, expanding their territory and consolidating their power. The Sami, the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia, were particularly hard hit. Their nomadic lifestyle based on hunting and gathering was ill-suited to the conditions of the Fimbulwinter. The animals disappeared, the berries withered, and the traditional ways of life were threatened. They were forced to seek refuge among the Norse, sometimes as slaves, sometimes as allies. There's a chilling detail from an Old English text, the encounter between Alfred the Great and Ottar, a Viking from Norway. Ottar described his homeland as very long and very narrow, a land dominated by rocky terrain and wild mountains. A land where everything grazing, farming was dependent on the sea. It was a stark, uncompromising landscape, a reflection of a people forged by hardship and resilience. 200 years after the darkest days of the Fimbulwinter, something began to shift. The dust settled, the snow melted, and the sun returned, but it wasn't a return to the old ways. The old social structures had collapsed, the old gods were forgotten. A new world was emerging, a world built on violence, ambition, and a thirst for wealth. The Vikings, those legendary seafarers and warriors, were not simply raiders and plunderers. They were also explorers, traders, and settlers. They established colonies across Europe, from Iceland to Russia, from North America to the Middle East. They brought with them their skills, their beliefs, and their way of life, a way of life shaped by the hardships they had endured. The rise of militarized elites, fueled by the chaos of the Fimbulwinter, was a crucial turning point. The old chieftains and jarls, accustomed to a life of relative peace and prosperity, were replaced by ambitious warriors who sought to build their own kingdoms through conquest and intimidation. These new leaders understood the importance of a strong army, a loyal following, and a ruthless determination. And then there's Ragnarok, the Norse myth of the end of the world. The Fimbulwinter wasn't just a winter, it was the prologue to Ragnarok, the final battle between the gods and the forces of chaos. The myths weren't predictions, they were warnings, a constant reminder of the fragility of existence, the inevitability of destruction, and the cyclical nature of time. The sagas, preserved through oral tradition, became a repository of the trauma, a way to make sense of the chaos. 200 years after the Fimbulwinter, the stories were still being told, still being retold, each generation adding its own layer of interpretation. The images of endings and beginnings, of gods and monsters, became deeply embedded in the collective consciousness, shaping the Viking worldview. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. The abandonment of settlements, the decline in population, the shift in power from western Norway to eastern Sweden, these are all indicators of a profound transformation. But it wasn't simply a return to normalcy. It was a deliberate choice, a conscious effort to build a new society on a new model. Consider the landscape itself. The rise in sea level, the changing river courses, the shifting patterns of vegetation, these were not merely natural phenomena. They were the result of human actions, of deliberate choices, of a society adapting to a new reality. The Vikings weren't passive victims of circumstance, they were active agents of change. Let's think about this for a moment. Imagine witnessing the deaths of half your population, the collapse of your social institutions, the utter destruction of your world. How would you cope? How would you rebuild? Would you cling to the old ways, or would you embrace the new? The Scandinavians of the 6th century faced a similar challenge. They were forced to confront the abyss, to rebuild from the ashes, to forge a new identity in the face of unimaginable loss. The Vikings didn't just survive, they thrived. They became the architects of a new era, a period of exploration, expansion, and innovation. Their legacy is still felt today in the languages they spoke, in the laws they created, in the art they produced, and in the stories they told. But let's return to the beginning. Was the Fimbulwinter truly a harbinger of doom, or was it simply a catalyst for change? Was the collapse of the old world a tragedy or an opportunity? The answer, as always, is complex and multifaceted. It wasn't just the volcanic winter. It was the slow, inexorable warming of the climate, the gradual erosion of the land, the inherent instability of a society built on small, scattered communities. It was the rise of militarized elites, the lure of wealth, and the ambition of individual leaders. The Vikings were not simply victims of circumstance, they were active agents of change. They adapted, they innovated, they conquered. They built a new world out of the ruins of the old. And as they sailed across the seas, seeking new lands and new treasures, they carried with them the memory of the Fimbulwinter, a reminder of the fragility of existence, the inevitability of destruction, and the cyclical nature of time. So, as the wind continues to howl across the fjords, as the snow falls on the mountains, and as the sun sets over the horizon, let us remember the Vikings, the people who faced the darkest days of their history and emerged from the ashes, stronger and more resilient than ever before. But one final question remains. If the Vikings were so adept at navigating the storms of life, why did they ultimately fail to prevent the end of their world?